Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, ecological, and political crises that we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. This week I spoke with Phoebe Barnard. Phoebe is a climate scientist who has worked across very many sectors of the climate problem, from biology to women's leadership in the global south. She's also the co-founder of the Stable Planet Alliance, a group that is investigating overpopulation and hyperconsumption. They're currently working on a paper that will be submitted to the United Nations. They're looking at developing top-down policy plans and also bottom-up grassroots organization. Now, it struck me just before jumping on the call with Phoebe that actually I hadn't talked about population on the show yet. And that seems unfathomable. Planet Critical has been running in its current form for about 9 months. So how is it that the population question has not yet come up? Well, it's a very divisive question. It's a very emotional question. It's a very historical question with roots in eugenics and racism and these things that we absolutely cannot ignore. And yet Phoebe says we have to take those concerns very seriously, but we also have to take the problem of overpopulation very, very seriously. This is a conversation that goes back and forth a lot on the population question. It was really, really fascinating to get into the morality of it, the data of it, the politics of it. And we come up with different ways of framing this problem. And I think the framing that I enjoyed the most is the population question is also a question of intergenerational rights. What planet are we leaving for future unborn children? What do they deserve? Can reducing our own birth rates give them a better future that they do deserve? I hope you all enjoy this episode. There's a lot of meat in it, and it certainly ponders a lot of questions. If you do enjoy it, please share it far and wide. If you're loving the show, support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com or on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. And a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community who keep this project going. Phoebe, it's such a pleasure to have you on Planet Critical. Thank you for joining me on the show.
Such a pleasure. You've had amazing guests. Privileged to be even in regarded as remotely in that camp.
Thank you. I feel so blessed with the kind of people that I get to interview and speak with and learn from. And I'm so glad to sort of offer this value as well to listeners who are in the process of learning about the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And your name came up very, very early on. It's just taken us a while to find a time to do this. So certainly the other guests think you're in this camp.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we're finally pulling it together at last. It has been a while.
Me too. Let's do a whistle-stop tour of your career and then get into the Stable Planet Alliance.
The short version is started out as an evolutionary biologist, ecologist, working on behavior of birds and energetics and things like that. But my mind was always more broadly focused. I love the detailed field science, but I was always very idealistic, even at the age of 61 now. I'm horrifically idealistic. So I went into conservation biology after I got back from a PhD at Uppsala University on sexual selection and birds' fancy plumages. Then, I guess migrated into global change ecology, vulnerability to climate change and other land use changes, other big transformative issues. And finally into kind of environmental futures, societal futures, leading to a point at which I felt I needed to go right for the jugular of the issues that are driving all of our planetary and societal crises.
And what are those issues?
I felt that, with everything I'd been doing throughout my whole life, breaking my back and my whole team's back, working really long hours a day and achieving some good things, but that they were so ephemeral in fleeting successes unless we could go right to the problem of human impact on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at it, I realized that that's a couple of really basic biological things are our numbers and our uh, propensity to want to have it all, to consume a lot. So it's population and consumption. But those are also kind of cross cut with the lens of inequality and corruption and the worst parts of our human behavior. So I decided eventually, after working on biodiversity and climate change in government with one foot in academia for much of my career in Africa, that I would come back to the USA after 38 years away and get stuck into humans and our bottom line issues of our impact on the planet. Crazy thing, really, really unwise, probably, but I felt, at this time in my life, I need to do it. And I'm also, old enough and stroppy enough that I can wade into the center of a debate and not feel timid about it.
Good for you. How interesting, how important that is, I suppose, given the kind of political actors and deniers and all the skeptics that we're up against in terms of trying to dismantle the power vacuum and do something.
Yeah, and it's ironic because I grew up as a very, I don't know, easily wounded child who found it hard to take constructive criticism, never mind destructive criticism. So over the years, I've had to grow a thicker skin.
Mm.
I didn't start out that way.
So, did you found the Stable Planet Alliance then upon your return to the USA to deal with these issues of overpopulation and hyperconsumption?
I co-founded Stable Planet Alliance with two men who wanted to make things happen, but recognized that they, couldn't themselves do it. Those were Chris Tucker, the chairman of the American Geographical Society, who had written a book called Planet of 3 Billion.
Okay.
Really interesting geographer, political scientist, spatial data geek. And a man called Peter Fikowski, who is a MIT trained physicist and a serial entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, who is
Mm.
deeply committed to the future of humankind. And to be honest, Peter initially wanted me to set up an organization, just another organization working on population. And I said, no, not going to do it. Population
Why?
needs to be spoken about in the same breath as hyperconsumption, or it won't get anywhere. And, also there are many good existing population organizations out there. And in the current climate, especially in the USA, uh, sometimes they're struggling, but they've, without exception, understood the need to embrace hyperconsumption. So I said to Peter and also to Chris, I'm not going to start a population organization, but what I will do, if this, if I can persuade you of this, is start a global coalition of like-minded groups working on the economy, hyperconsumption, population, women's leadership, women's voices, and bring these issues of population and hyperconsumption together, and let all the people who have not been speaking up about the issue, i.e., women around the world, and especially women of the global south, have their voice. So, Stable Planet Alliance was born officially only about 8 months ago,
Right.
and as a global coalition. And Girl Planet Earth, which is a project now of Stable Planet Alliance, was born as a global platform for women around the world to speak up on those issues in their own voices and their own words.
Why the focus on women? Why is that important when thinking about a stable planet?
Two things I want to say about that. One, women have been unheard mostly, particularly women that are not of privilege, but are coming from around the world from different cultures, different faith communities, different professions, and have strong opinions about what they want to do with their lives and how they want to be empowered to to how they are taking power to live their lives as they wish, and their observations about the state of our planet. And that we need to lead off with that. Women's leadership has always been really important to me, but especially in the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 6 years, since I was fortunate enough to be asked to go on a Women in STEM leadership course to Antarctica
Wow.
with the Homeward Bound Project. But the second thing is, I guess, although we're leading off with women's voices, it's really clear, I think, to most of us that men, frankly, in the economic machine that we all are constrained by currently, men have been a significant part of the problem, but they also need to be a big part of the solution. So getting men talking about what's important in life, what their measures of success are, how they identify what status or wealth means to them. You know, in many parts of the world, wealth is still defined by the number of wives and children you have. So just
Mm.
getting men talking is really important too. And as Chris Tucker said to me when we first started talking, after our uh, paper, World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency, and he said, wow, you guys mentioned the P word of population. Scientists don't often do that. You know, thank you. Here's my book.
Mm.
Um, he said to me at that stage, you know, a big part of the issue is just getting people talking. And I thought, well, I've been doing that most of my career. I can do that. Let me get stuck into it, because my co-authors of that paper, you know, all amazing men in their own right, but all white men in academia, none of whom had worked in the developing world. They weren't going to deal with these issues. So let me step up to the plate, and now's my time.
Mm. I think it's a very important thing to always remember about the patriarchy is that it hurts men as much as it hurts women,
Hmm.
because the problem is, you know, class and inequality and all of these permutations.
Yeah.
However, it does seem I really want to get into this population and consumption thing because I was thinking about this actually before we jumped on the call. We have not had the P word on Planet Critical in the year whatever that it's been running. I have not discussed population with anybody.
Yeah.
And it seems that there is a distinct fear in the scientific community to engage with this topic because of, you know, the very recent history of eugenics in Western colonial history. And it also seems to me that, you know, the difference is that population in cannot be part of the problem in and of itself because it is because of the difference in consumption levels in different populations around the world, depending on what resources and energy and wealth that we have access to.
Yeah, precisely. And there's been an absolutely horrific history, but that doesn't give us a free pass to ignore it and hope that the problem will go away. And instead of engaging honestly and, you know, bravely on the issue, people have been content to just kind of turn on each other and eh, and finger point and bicker. And we don't have time for that. You know as well as I do, Rome is burning, and we've got to just figure it out. In Namibia and also in South Africa, when I was working there for years on climate change and biodiversity, I ran big national teams to, you know, start and get going strategic planning on those two issues in those countries. And I got known as the, you know, the woman who would metaphorically lock people in a room with a set of boxes of pizzas and say, you've got to sort this out, come up with a solution, come up with a matrix of, you know, what you're going to do by when, who's going to lead it. And, you know, here are the pizzas. I'll let you out when you've solved it. And I guess I'm sort of taking that approach here. We don't have the luxury of saying, first we'll treat hyperconsumption and then we'll treat population. Or, um, you know, it's okay to bicker and turn on each other. Even this past week, I've had a bunch of colleagues in conservation biology saying they weren't going to read a paper by some of my colleagues, scientists warning on population, by really respected sociologists, ecologists, and, Eileen Christ, Paul Ehrlich, Bill Ripple, Bill Rees. And they weren't even going to read it because it was about the P word. Really, people? Are we going to go down with a bang and a whimper, both of them at once in civilization, because we are tiptoeing around issues that we've got to figure out? And the fact that some people in the past, and frankly, sadly, even now, can be racist in their approach or eugenicist in their approach does not allow us to avoid it. So we've got to come together in a rights-based human rights and planetary justice framework and let women speak up about this issue first and figure out a way to voluntarily and ethically and gradually but soon bend that curve, both on population and hyperconsumption at the same time. It takes a big mind shift to make this happen and big changes to our economy.
I want to keep picking this scab, though, metaphorically, because when discussing population, does it not have to be a localized discussion because of this consumption problem and because of the resource inequality and the wealth inequality and the energy inequality? In Europe, for example, birth rates are declining, and equally, the average consumption per capita is outrageous unless you're France because you did the right thing, a couple decades ago and went nuclear. So the population of the UK versus the population of Namibia and the growth or decline of birth rates, it's going to have a different effect on the planet, surely. And so are these conversations and these papers that are being written using the P word about population, are they focusing on these localized issues, or is it talking about the sort of generalized global issue of population? And is that fair? I mean, surely the people who are concerned about bringing population into the debate have good reason for their concerns.
It depends who's writing it. Some people are really mindful, thoughtful, well-grounded in reality of the issues, and they're talking about it appropriately. And I think that the paper that just came out, led by Eileen Christ, is a good example of that. Not everybody is talking that way. But I think we've all got to get real about the state of the world. It's no longer a simple situation as it was even 20 years ago when I was still a negotiator at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And the global South and the global North would bicker about who was at fault with the state of the planet. It's the affluent North. No, it's the overpopulating South. It was never honestly that simple, but it's especially not that simple now. Affluence becomes a poison wherever it is in the world. And the USA and a few other countries, Kuwait, Luxembourg, Canada, Australia, are all in much the same camp. But affluence has popped up, inequality, obscene inequality has popped up everywhere in the world. And people in Nigeria, for example, and Lagos are just as likely as affluent people anywhere to want to fly to London and do their shopping or have a weekend holiday in Budapest. And it's gotten out of control. So we have to talk more in a nuanced way about where the problem is, what the problem is, and not just have knee-jerk finger-pointing insults about the other. We've got to get around a table using the kind of civil discourse methods that we have in conflict resolution and figure out how to go forward, because we all bear collective responsibility for the state of the planet, not necessarily individually, because big chunks of humanity cannot in any way be said to have personal responsibility for the planet. But both systemic change and individual change need to, really accelerate. And we're not going to do that if we continue to sit and argue about what's the problem or who should be allowed to talk about it. And I've gotten really impatient with people that should know better at this late 11th hour, almost 12th hour for humanity.
Let's go through some of the data then on population. Oh, how many people can the biosphere support?
I'm a person who's very particular about that issue. I don't believe in giving a number. It's probably between the ranges that are often talked about now. Chris Tucker's planet of 3 billion on the high side, and perhaps the recent figure that was coming out from that Stonehenge type of structure that was vandalized in the US state of Georgia recently, where someone had carved out an inscription about a population of 500 million on the earth. Now, it's going to take a long time to get back there. And most people aren't even willing to talk about doing more than stabilizing the planet. In fact, most people just accept almost exponential growth as a continuing reality, and to talk about anything else is somehow rights insulting in a rights context. But we're not thinking about intergenerational rights when we have these discussions. And maybe I'll get onto that in a second. But my personal view is that we've got to get people walking in the right direction without getting hung up on a numeric goal. Because again, it's another thing for people to bicker about. And personally, with 8 billion people, we've got to start the momentum going much more. I mean, so many countries with coercive pronatalist policies, like increasingly the US, China, Iran, Hungary, a lot of countries that the US might think that it doesn't like to be associated with, Poland. Increasing number of countries are moving in precisely the wrong direction. But we need to get the mass of humanity accepting that planetary impact is likely to cause the collapse of civilization within the lifetimes of someone your age, possibly within my lifetime. And we need to figure that out and degrow both our economy and our numbers as fast as humanly possible. Some initial modeling suggests that we might be able to get back to a population of 3 billion and a total fertility rate of 1.5 children per woman sometime in the 22nd century without coercive methods, without policy measures, without autocratic governments, just through the changes of approach and choice and increased access to birth control.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean that is a change in policy. Increase access to birth control, also increase access to education. The higher educated a woman is, typically the less children she
Not
has.
coercive policies, I suppose. I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
Because there is a huge difference between 4 billion and 3 billion. I'm not a mathematician. I can't do that percentage. But a
Yeah.
lot. It's actually a terrifying difference.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Yale, the Yale 360 program, there's been a very good recent article, I can't remember the authors, just in the past week or two, talking about simply reducing the number of unwanted pregnancies will have a significant impact on climate and, by extension, on biodiversity loss, on plastics pollution, on all of our societal pressures and crises. So I guess, as David Attenborough and other people have observed over the years, either we figure out a way to do this voluntarily and mindfully and within a rights-based structure, or we let nature do it for us, or perhaps autocracies do it for us, and there will be misery and chaos all around. So the choice is ours.
What does a right-based structure for reducing population look like, though? Like increased access to birth control, sure, but that's still,
Yeah.
the autonomous choice of people of, people can be on birth control for 10 years and then decide to have 7 children. So
My two daughters were born on birth control, but,
okay.
you know,
Yeah.
um, I was very happy to have them. But absolutely, that's a significant issue. So we need to have options for people to prevent unwanted pregnancies despite
Mhm.
birth control. We need to have the kind of governance and leadership systems that are much more heavily reflecting of women and women's wishes,
Mhm.
because women's wishes, with some notable exceptions in the US and other countries, are quite distinct from the kinds of policies that coercive pronatalist countries have.
Mhm.
And also, I think that we do need to make really practical things like all hormonal based contraceptives more freely available over the counter in
Mm.
countries around the world, things like
Mhm.
that. Education and dialogue. And,
Mhm.
we've put some time into dialogue and Stable Planet Alliance and Girl Planet Earth because we know that just shifting people's mindsets and wading into conversations where people are engaged in fruitless bickering can help change how people think about the problems and the solutions.
What are some coercive policies that could be implemented in the coming decades if we don't all voluntarily stop having as many children?
Oh, you just have to look at the southeastern USA to see some examples that abortion becomes completely illegal, even in cases of rape or incest, even of children, that women are prevented from traveling to other places to secure abortions, that there are tax incentives and disincentives. I think even in Britain it's been discussed of taxing child free parents. And there are
Yes.
insidious.
So, so these are coercive pro-natalist policies, but what would some coercive
Ah,
population reduction policies look like?
Well, we have examples from China and India that went horribly wrong in so many ways.
Mhm.
They were effective at their stated policy goal, but they were horrendous from a humanitarian and rights perspective. I fear that when people recognize that the capitalist pie does not grow,
Mhm.
that the planet is a finite pie, and that with every 80 million net new mouths to feed every year, which is what we are still talking about, that each person's share of the pie has to decrease to accommodate that. That really simple, really fundamental point seems to still be lost on most people. So when governments realize that, and wars are breaking out over food and water, and as is already happening in some countries, then and between some countries, then I expect that we may have coercive anti-natalist policies put in place. And neither one is desirable.
Mm.
People should be able to choose. People need to be able to understand that maybe it doesn't need to be culturally expected that their role in life is to reproduce, to marry, to have 2.1 children and 2 dogs and whatever. That they can choose alternative meaning and purpose and lifestyles that allow them to contribute to civilization and the planet in a more productive way. And many people are, of course, choosing those lifestyles, not just in Europe and North America, but all around the world. And there's a really refreshing amount of dialogue about it. But we don't want to go to the alternative. And if we don't hurry up with dialogue and voluntary measures, then we likely don't have a choice. And that's a scary thought.
Seems to me still that the problem is market forces. because you mentioned food, for example. Food production is on the rise. It has been on the rise for forever, pretty much, apart from like a one dip recently, I think about 5 years ago.
Mm.
There is so much in the world. Some people I speak to say there is actually more than enough to go around. The problem is this kind of, capitalist ideology that encourages and celebrates hoarding of resources rather than redistribution. So I suppose my fear about the population discussion, and I know that I have kept it on population rather than talking as well about this interplay between population and overconsumption. Um, but is that if we don't fix and address the market forces that are ensuring this destruction of the planet and this terrible inequality and hunger and all of these things that actually are solvable and within our power to change, then what we will see is perhaps sort of an increasing inequality whereby, I don't know, people get child credits and the elite get to have 15 and, they represent the consumption of like 15,000 people. And yet, the marginalized, so, your LGBTQ community, your people of color, people in the global south will not be allowed to have children. And what's that going to do culturally, diverse? I mean, you can just see how it could all go wrong so fast.
Everything could go horribly wrong so fast. And that's one of the worst, most obscene, most insidious examples. So let me be really clear. We cannot solve this with the economy that we have. And
Mm,
when I used to be teaching this 30 years ago, it was a controversial idea, and some of my students would argue with me, or if I gave a public talk, people would get upset and argue. Now, a lot of people, even if they're quiet about it, they know in their hearts of hearts that the global hyper-consumptive, predatory, voracious capitalist economy has to go. We should have recognized this more than 40 or 50 years ago. But the fact was, it was still working for a lot of people then. And it became the case that the rich were growing visibly richer and the poor visibly poorer. But still, the people who controlled the economy were benefiting. So, Stable Planet Alliance has really embraced at the core of what we do a fundamental alternative to GDP, to growthism, to capitalism. And the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, the Center for Sustainable Economy, and hopefully Donut Economics Action Lab will all be working together in the same direction on this. But I think we, in the scientists' warnings into action framework that we published last year at COP26 with, 15 scientists, economists, and governance specialists from around the world, we identified this as one of the fundamental problems without which we cannot solve things. But look at us, we're right at the 11:59 moment here,
yeah.
and we're trying to achieve fundamental change in the economy, in our broken political systems, in our psychological mindsets, our cultural traditions, all at once.
Mm.
It's almost an impossibly steep task. But as I sometimes say, the only real benefit of having 8 billion people on the planet is that we've got enormous talent gene pool to work on multiple problems all at once. The risks are high, but we don't have a choice but to attempt it.
So I saw a tweet by Elon Musk, and I don't know how that happened because obviously I don't follow him and I don't like him. But he like had his nth child recently, or at this had a whole bunch of children with two different women around about the same time last year or something.
Mm.
And he was tweeting about the fact that the biggest crisis in his perspective is population, but the other way,
Yeah.
that we're underpopulating the world and that we all need to do our best to continue populating the planet with more and more people. Um, why do some people think that? What is their argument for that? Do you know?
They're in bubbles of privilege. It's hard to come up with any alternative, explanation for that. They're in terrible bubbles of privilege. And of course, he likes being provocative.
Mm.
And people who are somewhere on the spectrum sometimes have an easier time saying what they think needs to be said. I understand there's been some discussion between Greta Thunberg uh, relating and maybe and Elon Musk, but certainly relating to Elon Musk.
Okay.
He, of course, is easily accused of just wanting to build enormous numbers of passengers to go to Mars. But I don't
Good
honestly
point.
think it's that. I think that's just a kind of cheap shot. Um, Many people of privilege uh, have enormous blind spots and don't see them as offensive, deeply unethical, completely contrary to what they may be doing for good in another sphere, like trying to transform the global transportation fleet. Like, I would agree that Musk has done some good on that. But yeah, part of our problem is trying to identify and talk through our blind spots. I don't have any hope that Elon Musk will be interested in engaging in that. But fortunately, quite a few other wealthy men are engaging in that. And that holds some hope for the future. But ultimately, the people that benefit from capitalism are not really interested in exploring how to change that, even when you point out that, like everything else, things are not binary about the economy. It's not either capitalism or communism. There's a lot of good um, uh, middle ground options. And I've been fortunate to live in Sweden and see how it really benefits the community and the public good without destroying the planet and eroding people's autonomy and integrity and pride and food security, etc.
What is the consumption per capita in Sweden? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't know in the top of my head. It's a high consuming country, so don't
Yeah.
get me wrong. It's not the solution for everyone to live the way Swedes do. A big chunk of their consumption, however, is related to the climate they inhabit. And
Mm.
I think we have to understand that as the tropics become so risky for people and hundreds of millions of climate migrants are moving around the world, that this is going to pose a huge challenge for our goals to reduce hyperconsumption. I was working on climate migration before I started the Stable Planet Alliance. And, for me, that's a very stark metric for
Mm.
how we must choose the kinds of humans that we want to be, either as communities that are likely to receive climate migrants. We can either be welcoming and prepared and have integration services such as I experienced as a short-term immigrant to Canada when I was studying there, and also in Namibia and South Africa and so on. You can either welcome migrants or you can be reactive and xenophobic and violent, and chaos and anarchy result. So which is it going to be? Are we going to choose to be the best kind of humans that we can be or the worst?
Yeah. I mean, I think when you put it like that to communities, obviously they would want to choose the best. But the problem is that the best for some people is not the best for others, right? And typically, people with access to powerful spaces and access to the buttons and the levers are now making decisions for themselves rather than for the public that they serve. That is so evident in terms of Boris and Trump and Putin and all of these other sort of despots, male despots around the world, leading us further and further and further into crisis. And this was something I wanted to kind of get into as well. The questions that the Stable Planet Alliance seem to be asking and probing are fundamentally ideological, it seems. So how is it that how are you interpolating science and data and scientific method with ideological questions? How are you approaching these ideologies using science?
As a scientist, I am really committed to the principle of evidence-based public policy. I've been working in that space for a long time. But fundamentally, we've run out of time, I think, to be, optimally evidence-based. We have a situation now where in the next 7.5 years, we have to make fundamental transformative change to keep a stable planet, a stable climate, and even a stable society or civilization. And therefore, I think that the that we're probably going to end up going the way of what we had done, what we had uh, produced 20 years ago. I was a board member of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which had up until then, and I think probably still is, the biggest global assessment of the status and trends of ecosystems and their ability to support human nature, human
Mm.
economy, human well-being. And there were 4 scenarios that we produced. And one was essentially a business as usual and command and control scenario. Uh, and there were a couple of others, but the one that stood out to all of the community involved, and there were about 1,600 people involved in that assessment. The one that stood out as being the most compatible with a sustainable future civilization was um, about local experimentation with better ways of living. So I do find that experiments like the transition towns movement, other kinds of relocalization or um, alternative economy approaches to life are important experiments. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will be the ones that um, you know take take root, build traction, and become the basis for future civilizations. I'm sure that about 20 years ago, we saw the peak of multilateralism and, the kind of big, short lived, fatal experiment in globalization.
Mm.
And so we'll probably see a much more varied world again, which, as a biodiversity scientist, I'm happy about both natural diversity, cultural, and sociological diversity, I suppose.
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't know, in answer to your question, how do we put evidence-based and ideological things together? There's not much precedent for it, really. We're winging it as we go along, trying to get public policy shifts from the top down and trying to get public perception shifts from the bottom up with grassroots dialogue. And our goals may be difficult to achieve with that two-part approach, but that's how humanity finds its way in times of dizzying change. I don't really know that there's an alternative to that.
What sort of top-down policy changes are you guys advising on?
Well, we're putting together a white paper for the UN FPA, Family Planning Division, the population division of the UN, but also to all branches of the UN, and therefore through trickling down the member states of the UN on the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals do not pay nearly adequate attention to either of these issues, population or consumption. They do talk about the economy and they do talk about consumption, but it's pretty much still in a growthist framework, and population is virtually not mentioned. And there are some reasons for that, but corrective action is needed because this is not 1950 anymore. It's not the age of father knows best where everyone was in this delusion of growth.
Mm.
Now we are, you know, right at the crossroads of civilization. And so for the developing countries, which really do benefit most from the structure and the framework that sustainable development goals provide, um, a reform of them in their 2030 iteration, because the goals are reformed every 10 years, uh, is going to be really important to ground population and consumption right at the core of them so that future generations are adequately valued and catered for and their rights are protected. Because at the moment they are not. And the UN, my colleague Carter Dillard of the Fair Start movement, a founding member of Stable Planet Alliance, argues, and he's quite right, that the UN is failing its own um, Convention on the Rights of the Child by failing to ground intergenerational rights in the Charter.
Yeah, it's a really interesting angle. It makes it a more tolerable point of discussion when you think about it in terms of intergenerational rights, for sure. And I think that it's something Greta has done wonderfully throughout her years of campaigning,
Yeah.
is frame intergenerational rights at sort of the heart of this debate.
Have you yet interviewed Kate Raworth's partner, the UK philosopher Roman Jard? I don't know how to pronounce his surname, Jernard.
No, but I have Kate coming on the show in October.
Oh, great.
So
Great.
yeah.
He's an interesting person too. I would love to be I shouldn't say this online. I'd love to be a fly in the wall in their marriage because they must have the most incredibly interesting and powerful
Mm,
discussions. But she, as someone transforming the economy and reminding humanity of the things that should bound an economy, which currently aren't. And he, as a philosopher looking at deep time rights and responsibilities, he's written a very interesting book called The Good Ancestor, for example.
mm,
He's a really good person to talk about the rights of those who aren't in the room and the corporations that are increasingly starting to leave a blank chair in the room to represent children, to remind people that they're not there and they need to be included. He talks about Sophie Howe, the Welsh commissioner for the future, for example, and the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the Wellbeing Economy Governments, of which
mm,
there are now 6: Finland, Iceland, Scotland, New Zealand, Canada, and
mm.
Wales. How they are taking intergenerational rights very much more to the center of public policy. So, these are the kinds of top down policies that I think we do need to engage in for the survival of humanity, for the survival of millions of other species on this planet, and for the thriving of humanity. If we are optimistic enough, and sometimes I still am, to feel that humanity can not only survive, but will thrive and flourish in the future, then I think we have to understand the tension that is helpful between bottom up grassroots action and top down public policy reforms.
Sure, for sure. I suppose I obviously agree. I suppose immediately what I'm thinking of is my own personal obsession at the moment, which is power.
Yeah.
Power dynamics, power vacuums, where power is held,
Mm.
how to split power, how to create different kinds of power. And I
How
suppose
to share power, I hope.
how to share power, how to rip it away.
Mm.
And I suppose one of the things I fear um, now with everyone I speak to in all walks of life, not just on this podcast, but is that the question of power is so fundamentally difficult
Mm.
to address. How do you wrestle back control and power from people who are despotic and authoritarian, autocratic, even under the guise of democracy. How do you wrestle back power? It seems nigh on impossible. And so I fear that almost everything, every other conversation, is almost not a distraction, but we are busying ourselves. The good people of the world, we are busying ourselves trying to figure out what to do. And until we figure out that problem of power, it really doesn't matter, actually, does it? Because I mean, we could, you could draft a fantastic document explaining how everybody needs to have 1.5 or one child, or I'm still not sure how those
Yeah.
like 0.5s and 0.1s work.
Yeah.
But we could do that. We could speak to the UN. We could, there's so many things that we could, stop say you have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. You have to do this. You have to. We know what needs to happen, and the problem is that power is standing in the way.
Yeah, absolutely right. And there's no worse thing to try and dismantle in the space of, a decade or two than global capitalism.
Yeah.
I agree with you. It's a fundamentally important point. And of course, we all hope that more of the hyper affluent, which is not always the same as the powerful, can be persuaded to relinquish power, to share affluence. You will have heard that Warren Buffett, for example, is talking about giving away virtually the full sum of his wealth to every child in the world.
Right.
And, that's a pretty significant thing. And
When he's dead, though, yeah?
yeah.
Yeah.
When he's dead. And by that time, the pie of his wealth will be that much smaller. Um, but obviously, easiest is to get the powerful and the affluent to relinquish their power and wealth. But failing that, I'm still a little bit too attached to that cartoon where there's a cliff and a platform, almost like a gangplank. And out at the far end of the gangplank is a man pontificating, a politician. And there's the black void underneath. And at the other end, on land, there's the 99% all standing on the gangplank. When the 99% agree to walk off in the same direction, then those that aren't aiding and abetting the future of humanity and the planet will be tipped into the void. But of course, the the real world is not likely to be that way. I'm exasperated by people who will not work together for common purpose at these times, because despite what Michael Mann and others have pointed out about the tactics of the fossil fuel industry and other sources of power and affluence in the world to divide humanity and turn it on itself, we can do better than that. People need to call it out and talk about it, and it won't stop the problem of divisive bickering and finger pointing, but it can sure minimize it. I don't know.
I mean, when we started talking, I was thinking about the conversation I had with Catherine Stewart about after Roe v. Wade was overturned, about the history of the weaponization of abortion as an issue, right? How that was what the New Right did. They got together in a room. It's always a bunch of men in a room. Got together in a room, went down a list of 20 or so issues, landed on abortion, which was like a non-issue at the time, and went, that is something that we can use to generate support for our movement. And it's true. I mean, population is just one of those things that it is like intolerable. It is such an uncomfortable conversation. And I have thought, oh, it's interesting. Why am I having this emotional response to this thing? Why is it that I see a lot of people having emotional responses? I have seen a lot of critique from, like critical race theorists as well about how dangerous this conversation is,
Yep.
given our colonial history. And they absolutely need a seat at the table to voice those concerns and to
Yep.
ensure that any conversation is really fundamentally staying on track with intention. But still, I mean, where was I going with that? I have no
We
idea.
don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. And absolutely, I don't know whether you remember the band, the indie band, the Indigo Girls. They had
Yeah.
they had a wonderful song called Everything in Its Own Time. And it
Mm,
talks straight to what you've just said. And, the old boys in the room um, mapping out their strategy with the young boys being sent off to die. And,
yes.
with the rest of us being held hostage to their Machiavellian machinations. And this is why I really feel that investing in women's leadership is a big chunk of the solution.
Mm,
Uh, you know, and it cannot happen to the exclusion of men.
yeah.
But being able to empower women to have greater visibility, greater sense of strategy, greater self-esteem, and particularly at being able to confront difficult dialogues, that's all incredibly important. But, as a scientist also, I got to the point where I realized that science is only a tiny part of the solution. Power and the economy are the massive parts of the solution.
Mm.
And the best ways to shift those things are through public policy, public dialogues, and film. And that's why when I married a filmmaker, I was absolutely over the moon because I've always felt that film has the power to do things that certainly facts and figures and evidence cannot do for most people. It has the power to shift public opinion significantly. And of course, that's been weaponized by the far right.
Mhm. Oh God, I mean, narrative is so key to any struggle.
Yeah.
Um,
So we've got to deploy all three of these things, is all I'm saying. Public policy, public dialogues, film, and evidence based, evidence for adaptive management of our civilizational transformation.
I suppose it gets down to the question of, do we have a right to have children? Do we have a right to procreate? Um, or rather, perhaps in a more nuanced sense, is it not that I personally do not think that we have a inherent right to procreate? I don't think we have an inherent right to do much, just a hell of a lot of responsibility, um, which we should have. But do we? I suppose then it comes down to, do we just have the right to make choices? And in a world where so much autonomy and choice is being stripped from people, having a child is maybe one of, am I going to say that? Is that maybe, big maybe, one of the last things people maybe can do for themselves? One of the last things that they get to choose. Not having a child is a huge choice that modernity has given us as well. It's like,
Mm, mm.
it's so primordial.
It's a very primal, very intimate decision. I don't ever want to get to the point where we say to people, as some of my colleagues have recently, that people should only have the right to have one child,
Mm,
not more.
mm.
Stable Planet Alliance, just as an aside, is a big, broad church. And we value, as does the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we value togetherness and forward momentum over perfect agreement.
Okay.
There are certain lines in the sand that we will not cross on that issue, where rights are traded off in terms of racism or anti-immigration policies,
Yeah.
eco-nativism, or any of that. But nonetheless, we do disagree a little bit on the point of what these times call us to do.
Yeah.
And ecologically, um, in any other species, it would be accepted that a saturated population leaves fewer options for the individuals in that population.
Mm-hmm.
They have
Mm-hmm.
fewer territories, they
Mm-hmm.
have less access to food and water, all of those things. And we
Mm-hmm.
think that we humans are exempt from that in some way.
Mm.
I do not want to see any kind of coercion either way, but the nature of our overpopulation, and I use that word very rarely, almost makes it inevitable that autocratic policies or coercion of different kinds will happen. But fundamentally, we also need to respect that our focus, particularly in the affluent world and especially in the US right now, our focus on rights rather than responsibilities, our
Mm.
sense of entitlement and arrogance and idiocy is coercing future generations. It's coercing um, existing generations of women your age to consider not being able to have children, even if they want to. You know, that stripped rights away from people, and we've got to call it out as such.
Yeah, I completely agree on that point. I think and I think it's very interesting the distinction between rights and responsibilities. And I think framing everything is like the individual is always part of a community and a collective rather than just an individual existing out with a system really changes the framework of how we address all things. And yet, um, rights are still such an important part of the dialogue because if we're not vigilant,
Mm.
collectively all the time, they will be stripped from us, as Roe v. Wade proved.
Absolutely. And so rights and freedoms are kind of the same thing.
Mm.
And we have to acknowledge that we're heading into times where all of the freedoms that we thought we had in this generation that I've been lucky to grow up in. I was born in 1961 and I was the youngest in the family. So my siblings were all sort of World War II, post World War II babies.
Mm.
Um, all of that has been for those who were lucky enough to be born in the USA or other relatively wealthy countries. Those were times of generally stability. It didn't mean that there was equity. I was lucky to be born pretty white in a family that didn't have masses of money, but at least had love and education. Not everybody had that right. But this generation has become entitled and spoiled and obnoxious many times because of its sense that those are its God given right.
God given.
Yeah.
Yeah, very important caveat when discussing US politics, I think.
Yeah. And it's driving people away. I
Mm.
mean, this was the country of my birth, but for decades I felt that I was Namibian or South African, and not American because of this. And I've returned to it um, because of a swell of optimism around the time that Obama was president, only to arrive just before Trump became president.
Right.
So it's been an immense culture shock to be reminded of how blind spotted and culturally arrogant and comfortable and complacent and entitled Americans really can be. And we've seen the absolute ugliest of humanity since Trump came into power. He didn't start it, but he sure exacerbated it.
Well, he said it was okay to be a prick.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yep.
interesting. It's just, and again, this we come back full circle to finish up, but I suppose it is like when it is men like that that still have access to powerful spaces. I suppose that is the concern when then thrusting the conversation about population, because if it were to be weaponized, if it were to be used as a policy in the wrong hands, if it were, there are just, yes, as we said, so many ways that it could go wrong. And I suppose what we are now facing as a species, as a collective, as people, is the urgency of the situation where everything is going to go wrong versus the desperation of the situation where certain things could go wrong that would be regression and terrible. Do you choose your to go backwards into the past where racism and sexism were so worse than they are today and they are still despicable, or do you choose to go forward into the future where the planet goes on fire? Ah!
It's exasperating. It's been incredibly exasperating to have come from a career spent initially for more than 3 decades in 2 post-apartheid countries,
Mm,
back to the US and think, "Oh, shit, here we go again."
yeah,
Excuse my French.
yeah, yeah,
And it's horrifically familiar.
yeah.
But, um, I do think that we've got almost an impossible set of tasks. So this really is an all hands on deck moment for those people who are determined to find a better civilization in the future. And that's a minority of people. And
Yeah.
we've got to create it and we've got to draw everyone along with us and still be able to fend off against the rich, powerful, and troll empowering uh, men and others in the world that um, don't see or don't care,
Yeah.
that none of them, none of any of us will be alive, to
Mm.
be able to enjoy a better world.
I suppose one of the small uh, what would you say? I suppose one of the benefits of any population policy being implemented is it predicated on there not being a capitalist economy. There is no way that an anti-natalist policy would be implemented in a capitalist economy. So, by the very nature of its existence, one would hope or assume that that had meant a move to the left and to more collective thinking, and socialist infrastructures and all this kind of thing.
I'm a believer in social democracies, but my filmmaker husband, who is a consummate philosopher, always says to me, you can't fix the race car while it's driving. And yet we cannot pull the whole global economy into the pit stop to tinker with it. We've got
Mm,
to figure out how to get there from here
mm,
while it's moving. And that means, I realize belatedly to my dismay, it means that unless we wish to have um, anarchy and chaos for some decades across much of the world, then we are going to have to start from capitalism and reform it and figure out how to make it into something more approaching a kind of eco social democracy to make that work. And different countries will do it in different ways, and that's okay.
mm.
We probably have to let go of real elephants and albatrosses in the room, like the World Trade Organization, to make it
Mm,
happen.
mm. Which takes us back to power. The
Right. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. Can't
and
get around it.
endlessly circular.
Are you
Phoebe,
going to write a book? I hope you will.
am I gonna write a book?
Yeah, about this.
What, a nonfiction about power?
Yeah.
Move over, Michel Foucault. Um, I am thinking about doing a long form investigation into carbon, where the focus on carbon came from. I find it odd and suspicious that one greenhouse gas was picked and all of the marketing was done around that.
I'm
Uh,
making a film with my husband and a team at the moment on climate restoration. And
mm,
that's very much a film that's taking place within the capitalist economy as we currently know it. But I'm trying to imagine it moving beyond that. And
mm.
that's a whole nother topic that we won't get into. But I hear you on this.
Mm, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. I really am obsessed with the notion of power right now and what to
Yep.
do about it.
I think we all need to be really aware of it and not naive about it and be
Mm,
prepared for when it keeps trying to come for us. But it is already, even if it's just in Twitter trolls and, Cambridge Analytica and other kinds of information theft
Exactly.
wars.
Exactly. Yeah. Phoebe, thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
It's such, Rachel, thank you.
Thank you. My final question, as you know, is who would you like to platform?
I would suggest that guy Roman Jurnagic, Kate Rayworth's partner.
Mm,
And I interact only on Twitter with him. I don't know him personally. So maybe I would suggest him, but I can't introduce him
okay.
formally. Maybe Kate can.
Okay. Wicked. Thank you so much, Phoebe. It was such a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rachel. Cheers for now.
Cheers. If you want to learn more about the Stable Planets Alliance and their work, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is also in the description box below. As always, a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community who make all of this work possible. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you next week.